Well, good morning, and thank you for being here for the second day. If this day turns out to be as lively as the first day, I think we have a nice day ahead of us. As Tobin just announced, the subject is Duterte, Trump, Modi, Brexit is populism on the rise. If my grammar is correct, that makes for 3 proper nouns and 1 common noun. That could become a verb in 2 years if it happens. But jokes aside, the theme is indeed a very serious one. You could quibble about the definitions of populism, but the broad trend under discussion is whether we're watching the rise of people who seem to aggregate in themselves and their personalities the widespread resentment against ruling classes and elites, leadership that some of you might think is playing to the galleries, sometimes at the expense of what we know is truth, public figures who descend or reach out to the lowest common factor, and if they get successful in their quest, seem to be willing to do anything to stay in power. On the other hand, there also is an issue of whether so many of us who decry so-called populist politics may be missing something, that the people who vote in such leaders may actually be dancing to a different music from which we are separated because of our own prejudices. So to discuss this, we have an eminent panel of speakers this morning. Most of you are familiar with everyone except Frank, I think, because they've been here at previous panels. Each of them is doing critical work in their domains, and I must congratulate KAS for providing a fine balance between Asia, Europe, and the United States. So let me quickly introduce each of them briefly. I'll do that in their order of speaking. Each of them will speak for about 5 to 8 minutes, maybe 10 minutes if you have more to say. We'll start with Nicole Curato. She is a political sociologist, and it's good to set up any discussion like this against a mildly theoretical framework. I read some of her work, and I can tell you that Nicole does not over-intellectualize. She's now at the University of Canberra and has written extensively on democratic theory and practice with particular focus on the Philippines. She's going to tell us today about the Duterte phenomenon. And after that, we have Vincent Harris. He'd initially prepared some slides on Marine Le Pen, but I suggested that this audience would also be interested in what he has to say about American politics, particularly Trump, who both fascinates and worries us in no small measure. So most of you are well acquainted with his work, so I'll skip all that. But let me just say that what he has achieved in such a short time, he's barely 30 years old, I think, from what I read of your Bloomberg profile. They called you the man who invented the Republican internet. It's only possible in the digital age. After Vincent, we have Frank Priest, who's flown in from Germany. Frank specializes in Europe, and he's a senior figure at Konrad Adenauer, where he's deputy head of the Department for European and International Cooperation. With long experience in Europe, Frank, we hope you'll give us your take on Brexit. What happened there and why, and the big takeaways from it, especially from an Asian viewpoint. And finally, we have Astik Sinha. Again, I will not belabor you with lengthy introductions, but let me just say that Astik has been doing remarkable work in the digital communication space. And if you saw the chart that Maria showed yesterday, you'd see that Indians are taking big time to the net, and politicians are learning to play in it. So I won't take up more of your time. Nicole, you could go. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Ravi, for the introduction. And I think I will first begin my talk by responding to Torben's call of telling Frank that it's been a fantastic day yesterday. Let's put that on record. So, yes, and having said that, I think I will start the discussion by answering the question put forward in the topic this morning: is populism on the rise? And I think how I answer this question is, well, it depends where you look. Because if you look at the case of the Philippines, for example, there has been an established argument that the presidencies in the Philippines usually swing from a reformist to a populist leader since 1986. By making a distinction between a reformist and populist leader, I don't necessarily mean that one is better than the other. But if we take, for example, a look at the predecessor of President Duterte now, he calls himself a reformist. His agenda was very much a reform-oriented agenda. The presidential election prior to him, a populist almost won presidency. So he is a movie star, an action star with no political experience. A lot of people think he won the election, but that election for a lot of people is also considered rigged. So the argument here is populism on the rise? Well, it depends where you look. In the Philippines, it feels like it's a consistent swing between a reformist and the populist. And Mark Thompson makes that argument in the Journal of Democracy. If we look at Latin America, it feels like, no, actually, there's a decline in populism, right? So there was a moment when we look at Latin American leaders from Hugo Chavez, Evo Morales, Rafael Correa, Cristina Kirchner, and lots of other people in the region. It feels like there was a moment of the populist swing, but now we're looking at a post-populist time in Latin America. And of course, Europe is a different story, and of course, the United States is a different story. But my presentation this morning hopes to focus not particularly on Rodrigo Duterte, the populist leader, but with what I call populist publics. There is a tendency that when we talk about populism, we always look at it from the perspective of the populist leader himself. Sometimes there is an assumption that because a populist leader is a demagogue, whatever he says are just absorbed passively by an unthinking, manipulated citizenry. My argument is, at least in the Philippine case, that's not necessarily the case. For the past 2 years, I've been conducting field work among disaster-affected communities in the Philippines. So these are the most vulnerable communities affected by Typhoon Haiyan in 2013. And I had the privilege of actually witnessing President Duterte's rise to power last May 2016 because I was on the field and observed how a lot of his supporters tried to make sense of why this leader is particularly popular. So, of course, when we talk about Rodrigo Duterte's populism, I want to first qualify what particular kind of populism I'm referring to. In a journal article I published, I call this penal populism. It's the kind of populism that simplifies the issue of criminality in the country. So if the populism that we see in Europe is the kind of populism that distinguishes the nationalists from the immigrants, in Latin America, if it's a rich versus poor kind of populism, the dangerous other that is constructed in the Philippines are the drug addicts. So that has been the kind of discourse that has defined Rodrigo Duterte's populism. It's a differentiation of the virtuous public, I should do an air quote here, a virtuous public versus the dangerous other, which are the drug addicts. So I guess from a distance, it's easy to think that everyone who supports Rodrigo Duterte, especially if we focus on the discourses we see online, it's easy to caricature his supporters as people who want to kill all drug addicts, people who don't care about human rights. These are people who have no values, who will defend the president's rape jokes. I want to contest that caricature because at least from the kinds of discussions I've had with his supporters, I don't really see that. Instead, what I see here is a very negotiated kind of relationship with the president. The argument here is the people are actually trying to reinterpret the kinds of discourses that he says. I just want to give a couple of examples here and bring out the voices of these populist supporters that I've talked to. For example, I met Fe. She's a 47-year-old mother of 6. She told me that she hopes the rest of the country would look like Duterte's Davao. Davao is the city where Duterte was mayor before he became president. And she said she wished there's an alcohol ban after midnight. She also wished that all the troublemakers would get a dose of Duterte. So when I asked her what she meant, do you want these people to die when you mean a dose of Duterte? no, she said, actually, I just want my drunken neighbors to get disciplined. I actually don't want killings. And she actually hoped that the rumors about Duterte's allegedly murderous past was untrue. For her, this actually just means Duterte's tough talk is just a way of instilling fear on people. And she justified Duterte's approach because some people, based on her experience in her neighborhood, are just really pig-headed. I also met Ronnie. He's a driver, and he told me everyone he knew of the drug problem in his region long time ago before Duterte became president. When one of the mayors in a nearby town got shot in prison, he was so angry, and he said, the mayor shouldn't have been shot. And I said, but you're a Duterte supporter. Don't you support the killings of these drug dealers? And he said, no, I know he's a drug addict, but he was shot while he was already in prison. He should have been shot when he was still powerful. So here you see a different way of negotiating that, yes, I support the law of the jungle, but the law of the jungle should have a certain set of rules. Why am I bringing these examples? I raise these examples to show that different people who support the president negotiate the relationship with the president. So when people ask me, how can you make sense of the 84% trust rating of President Duterte? Are all Filipinos supportive of the killings? Well, not necessarily. What's interesting here is if we actually unpack what these people are saying, there's a lot of negotiation, there's a lot of complexity, there's a lot of competing rationalities that underpin their support for the president. So I think we have to shift the conversation. Instead of homogenizing people who support a populist leader, it's time to bring out the voices of these people and engage before we condemn.
Nicole, thank you for that. Could I just ask you, is it a single-issue penal populism, or is it a multi-issue populism? Because when he takes on the Americans, when he takes on the United States, he is taking on a people who really rate America quite high, more than Americans themselves in many cases.
Yes, absolutely. I think it was a Gallup poll that says Filipinos love Americans more than Americans love Americans. It's very fascinating because there are actually surveys that show that before the elections, if you ask Filipinos, what are your top 10 issues? Usually the issues that rank high are jobs, inflation. But when Duterte ran for president and when people were asked, what are the main issues that you want your presidential candidate to solve, they suddenly say criminality. So in a way, that's an indication that he was able to shift the discourse. But what I'm finding on the ground here is, yes, there's an overwhelming support for resolving criminality, but a lot of it comes subsequent to it as well. So for example, they like the tough talk, they like the authenticity. I wouldn't necessarily say it's a single issue penal populism, but that is kind of the umbrella issue that he uses as a framework to create his narrative.
Mm-hmm. And if I were to put it in a sociological context, which is your domain, would the Durkheimian concept of anomie apply in the Philippines, and is the Duterte phenomenon a reaction to that?
I don't even think it's anomic in the sense that this is not a breakdown of social order. It's a reinforcement of a particular kind of social order that people want to reclaim. Yesterday in the same room, I made an argument that what makes President Duterte particularly successful is he was able to give voice to what is unspeakable. What is the unspeakable before? Well, drugs. People know they have a neighbor who is a drug addict. People know that in the street corners, their kids might get harassed by a drug addict. But, it's an issue, it's there, it's latent, no one really politicized it. But you have here a candidate who was able to give voice to that unspeakable, that suddenly the issue is politicized, right? So it's a reassertion of particular values, I think, that some people consider important. But unfortunately, the way these values are articulated looks like it's an anomic set of values. So when the president, for example, tells the European Union or raises the middle finger at the European Union for imposing human rights criteria on the Philippines, then yes, we can say that, yeah, this is so anomic. But on the other hand, there is also this competing morality among populist publics that, well, yeah, sometimes good manners are important, but I prefer authenticity over good manners. Mm-hmm. So it's very much negotiated.
Thank you for that, very illuminating. Winston, your turn.
Thank you. I need the clicker, I think. Okay. Cool. Hello, y'all. My name's Vince. I come from Texas, the best state. We're as big as France, and I'm about to talk about France. Is populism on the rise? Yes, it is. on the rise. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about my experience in France. I worked for Marine Le Pen for 6 months. This year, I spent a lot of time with her, and I'm going to talk to you specifically about that today. But first, I know there was some discussion of definitions, but when you see this populism, I want to get in your brains for 1 second, because I think what you're thinking of right now is the title of this presentation. And what I would argue to you is even the title of this presentation and the way that we in the sort of media and political and intellectual elites, we are viewing this word very negatively. Obviously, I would believe that we're viewing it negatively because we are sometimes scared of it. And what I would tell you is, and if you look at the definition of populism, and if you look at some of the issue positions that these candidates actually are supporting, or the populist publics, I thought that was a very fascinating first conversation. And as you were talking about that, by the way, I kept thinking about myself and my wife, who are both who both sort of begrudgingly voted for Trump, and we dealt with lots of the same situations in our head that I felt like you were saying that the folks in the Philippines were. We didn't agree with a lot of what was being said, but we agreed with the authenticity element of it. So I saw ourselves in there too. So what is populism? Is it a concern of ordinary people? If so, count me on board, because this actually got cut off, but I'll say it to you. This is our preamble of the Constitution. We, the people of the United States of America, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. That's from our Constitution. We, the people, created our government. So in the United States, our government was founded by the people. And we even had a big debate about our Constitution and how much power that it gave the people when it was founded. There's some wonderful papers by an anonymous gentleman named Brutus, known as Brutus, who wrote some of the anti-federalist papers, who discussed how government was becoming too powerful. We needed to give power back to the people. And I see a lot of the same arguments that Brutus wrote in those papers as some of the populist leaders today. I took this screenshot because I wanted to show this to you, and I think this screenshot cuts apart a lot of the conversations on a lot of these panels. There were some discussions yesterday. I brought up a survey number. There was a survey number brought back from Astrid here. And this shows you back what is popular. I want to talk about that. Why do we call some of these leaders populist? Is it because their policies are popular? Well, just look at this Google search result. And I hope this is one thing that you all take away from this whole conference, is how the media, politicians, all of us are spinning constantly. None of us are better than anyone else. I Googled on Google here, Trump, I Googled on Google, okay, polls about Trump's refugee ban. Just look at this. Look at some of these answers as we're trying to talk about the problems in society here. The first answer says that voters support Syrian refugees. The second says, will they support? But then it says that there's a support and reduction of numbers. The third says the majority do support the ban. The fourth says that they're split. And the fifth is sort of your fake newsy thing. Shock poll, more than half Americans support. How can this all be true? How can it all be popular amongst citizenry? These were all in the past year. A lot of what we bring up in surveys, and I'm going to show you a survey from the Le Pen campaign, an internal survey that we did. But a lot of what the media is bringing up when they talk about surveys here, the questions are already rigged. So I don't want to go too far into this. But if someone asks, for example, do you support Trump's Muslim ban? There's already a bias in that question, right? But the answer, when there's articles written about it, don't talk about that. Next. Why? So what is popular? This is something I want to get in the mind of Donald Trump just for 1 second. Look at this. Super Tuesday Republican primary voters. 78%. And please remember our system in the United States. I worked for Ted Cruz, then I worked for Rand Paul. You have to win the Republican primary to be president. Donald Trump ran on the best issues in the Republican primary. He ran on the most popular issues in the Republican primary. Crazy support for his issues. 78% in Alabama support banning Muslims who are not citizens. 78% in Arkansas, 72% in Tennessee. Wow. So I would also argue something that we need to think about is not just populism in terms of an entire country, but to your point, populism in terms of who is keeping these people in power. Donald Trump is put in power by the Republican Party base. That's who put Donald Trump in power. And in lots of these swing states too, actually disproportionately Donald Trump's policies are favored, right? If you look at some of the bigger polls of the whole country, for example, about some of his policies, where we have states like California and New York and Illinois in there, they're going to be skewed. But if you look at Ohio, if you look at North Carolina, if you look at Virginia, if you look at Florida, Donald Trump's policies are incredibly, incredibly popular. Even funding of the border wall, incredibly popular, his policy. The man is a genius in terms of knowing what to run on. He is absolutely genius. He wrote in The Art of the Deal, there's this wonderful quote. It's a wonderful book. As soon as he started to beat us in the Republican primary, I said, I got to know more about this guy. I'm going to read The Art of the Deal. You all really should read it if you haven't. There's a really cool quote in there where he says he likes to practice the art of truthful hyperbole, which, as we all know, is kind of an oxymoronic statement. But that's how he lives. Building a border wall, having your supporters chant things, having Mexico build the wall, that's some truthful hyperbole. And Donald Trump understands that. He is an entertainer above all else. I want to talk to you now about France and a case study in France. And I want to take off some of this sheer. I had never worked for anybody before that you might consider populist in this room, although I take very serious issue with a lot of the definitions that the media is putting on that term nowadays, because I think they're using it to label people that they don't like, to be very frank. And I don't think that's very fair, okay? It's not very fair, because if you actually look at the back of who is supporting, who are these publics, lots of these parties are actually taking as many voters from the center right as they are from the center left. If you look at some of these certainly more European populist parties, and we're going to talk about France today. This was a survey taken in France, not known as a very far-right country, just 2 months ago. These are issues: total favor, strongly favor. Deport criminal immigrants. 84% of people in France deport criminal immigrants. Ban Muslim Brotherhood. 64%. Incredibly popular issues. Popular issues that Marine Le Pen ran on. So I want to talk to you a bit about this today. Is populism on the rise? That's the point of this panel. Certainly in France, if we looked at France as a case study, absolutely. Jean-Marie Le Pen in 2002 got 17% of the vote. Marine doubled that. Marine more than doubled, or about doubled, the popular vote. And let's be honest about this before we just shove Marine Le Pen away. Marine Le Pen could have won the French election. Okay, she could have won the French election. And she was running, again, how could she have won? Because the issues that she was actually talking about were issues that people care about. Before we dismiss these people come, that's why your starting was so perfect here. It's not about the leaders, it's about the people. That's what I think we need to understand more about populism. Why the rise in France? And I think you could take this and you could probably apply this to a lot of the leaders that we're going to talk about today. Disillusionment with the main political parties. Scandal, corruption. I don't know how closely you all followed all of the elections there, but François Hollande was as popular as Jean-Marie Le Pen was, Marine's father, meaning zilch popularity, right? Nobody liked either of them. François Fillon was in scandal. Job loss, dissatisfaction, reminds me of America too, right? Terrorism and immigration, okay? This next line is why Marine Le Pen lost, though. And this next line is why a lot of populist leaders lose. Because at the end of the day, in most of these countries, in lots of these countries, if they're talking about popular issues, do you know what I didn't show you on this? 84% said deport criminal immigrants they're in favor of. But this wasn't their most important issue. The most important issue was jobs and the economy. And Marine Le Pen, at the time, didn't really talk about that issue. She was talking about terrorism. She was talking about immigration for a country that cared more about where they were going to be working tomorrow and how they were going to feed their families. So populists can win if their messaging is right. If their messaging is right and they're not just talking about singular issues, they can win. So combining jobs and the economy, we surveyed everybody and we asked them what their most important issues were in France. If you combined everyone saying terrorism, it didn't add up to jobs and the economy. That was the number one issue. Polarization, we've talked about that. I want to talk about this too. Why are populist parties on the rise? Globalization. And by the way, all of us in this room, I think, would probably agree. We're all sitting in a very international conference. We love globalization. There are benefits, but not all of us are flying around the world, right? There's a lot of people that are stuck. And I think, and this is where I have to put a mirror up to myself as I fly here and realize that there's people that can't afford to be here. There are people that are actually feel like they've been hurt by this system. And they are mad. They are mad, just like the people that she talked to. They are mad. They were mad in France when Whirlpool, a company, sent all their jobs overseas, I think to Asia somewhere. They were mad about that in France. Social media. The ability to rail outside the system. Sometimes I wonder if some of these populist leaders actually what they'd do if they got in government, right? What would they do? It scares me sometimes, okay? But what would they do? Because so much of their gravitas is from railing and throwing bombs inside of the system. I have 2 more slides.
A couple of minutes.
Yes. A few misconceptions. Not all populist party electorate are center-right. We need to stop that. Populist is not far-right. They don't equal each other. That is just a farce. In all of these countries, that's a farce. Okay? The media's berating of populist parties helps grow the party. When the media writes stories that belittles populist leaders, which they did look, again, I worked for Rand Paul. I can tell you as my case study of one here. I didn't know if I'd vote for Donald Trump, but the more the media hit Donald Trump, the more I sure as hell was on Donald Trump's team. I will tell you that, just to be very frank. Okay? No one's going to mess with my guy, and certainly the media is not going to mess with my guy. Okay? Every time that the media hits these people, it only helps them. There is a correlation with populist party preference and education level across many of these countries. That was the case in France. It's the case, it was the case in the United States. I'm going to end with 3 books. This first book on the left, I just finished, wonderful book if you haven't read it yet, Hillbilly Elegy. It's very much specific to who the populist publics are of Donald Trump in the United States. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. The second book was written by a professor at the University of Texas. It's called Niche News, and to me, it's the best book about echo chambers and about what is going on with these populist parties and how their supporters get information, not from the mainstream media, but from each other. And the third book, The Populist Explosion, is a wonderful book too. So just in summary, I feel like we just need to be careful before we label parties, and we should be careful when we're labeling that we do it as objectively as we possibly can, and just realize that that folks like Marine Le Pen, she's not Hitler, okay? I worked with her, I was with her, I spent a lot of time with her. She's a nice lady, and she feels, whether right or wrong, whether you agree or disagree, she feels what she was doing was best for her country, and that came from deep down within her, and I respect her for that. So thank you all very much.
Vincent, thank you for that, and especially for that cautionary word to the media to stop labeling people and berating people. I'm sure that's something that will be taken into account, and I'm sure some of your points will be responded to by Frank in his presentation. But I want to ask you something. I want to take you back to a successful campaign in which you were involved, which is the Ted Cruz campaign. If I'm not mistaken, he announced his candidature in 2011 on Twitter. Yeah. And he raised about a third of the money that his rival had raised. How did you help him win at that time?
Well, I would say that the best thing that Senator Cruz did was he took, most Republican primary voters in the United States, they watch Fox News. Everyone knows that, right? And what we tried to do online was parallel everything that was going on Fox News from a digital perspective. So think of your average Republican primary voter. They go home after a hard day's work, they turn on Fox News, they have their laptop on their lap and their phone in their hand on Facebook. I wanted to be sure, and Senator Cruz wanted to be sure, that whatever they were seeing on TV on Fox News, we were repeating that messaging from Senator Cruz's campaign on Screen 2 and Screen 3. If Screen 1 was talking about the Fast and Furious scandal, which was a scandal where our Attorney General sold arms, I think, and they ended up in drug cartels' hands. We talked about it on Facebook, and Senator Cruz took up arms. We talked about issues that a senator might not even have anything to specifically do with because Fox News was talking about it. And all Republican primary campaigns are becoming this. People are running for governor and they're talking about issues that are on Fox News because that's what's been agenda set by the media as the important issue for the base. So Senator Cruz talked to, guys, Texas, y'all, is a pretty frickin' conservative Republican primary electorate. And what we used to say before Trump beat Ted Cruz is, Senator Cruz is second to the Lord Jesus Christ in Texas amongst these Republican primary voters. People loved Ted Cruz. People still love him, but they really, really loved him. And why did they love him? Because he told them what they wanted to hear repeatedly, again and again and again. And when he went to Washington, the first thing that he did was shut down our government because he promised us that in the Republican primary.
Yeah. One more question as a follow-up. When you look at a campaign and you design a campaign, there are objective facts on the ground, but how much is invented?
Is what?
How much is invented or twisted? Could you give us a frank response to that?
How much is twisted from?
Or, based on partial information, partial facts. In the interest of...
Look, guys, our job in campaigns is to win an election. And, I'm just going to leave it there.
Okay. Frank, you go now. And
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think there are a lot of aspects in Vincent's presentation which I do not need to repeat because I'm sharing some of the opinions. When I look to the question, is populism on the rise, I would be a little bit more skeptical because looking back in history for some decades, this is not a new phenomenon. When I look, for example, one of the latest copy of Foreign Affairs, one article has the title, "Populism is not fascism," doing a lot of comparison about what issues brought, for example, fascist movements in the 30s, in the 20s to the rise. There are a lot of differences, there are a lot of similarities. When we look to different continents, to different countries, there always had been quite successful populist movements. I have some working experience in Latin America, and you can say that it's nearly a similarity to speak about populism and to speak about politics, because in many cases people with a populist approach had been very successful for a long time. If you mean Alan Garcia in Peru, if you look for Perón in the 30s, in the 40s in Argentina, a lot of people had been successful. When it comes to Europe, a lot of phenomena helped by the media, helped by the circumstances. If you look to Silvio Berlusconi in Italy, we have a lot of examples from each and every country. So I think populism as a method has been quite successful in certain circumstances. And I think this is the case today. And the circumstances had been mentioned carefully by Vincent. I think, for example, in Europe, you can find two big issues. One is migration, and the other is the globalization and its effects, especially on the middle classes. People with fear, people losing jobs, and people looking for answers which they do not think they find in what the traditional politics and politicians are doing. And there is quite a good saying in the United States which goes, "It's easy to be brilliant if you not even try to be fair." And I think this is what characterizes a lot the populists. It's not the issues, it's the answers. And if we look at the complexity today, globalization, for example, it's easy to have answers like Mr. Trump, like others, putting America first, telling the people what they want to hear, and saying, okay, I have the solution, it's the nation. Mr. Orban and others say the nation state could be helpful to protect people, to help this middle classes against deprivation, losing ground in the globalized situation, blaming it to the migrants, they are costing us our jobs, and so having this kind of hate. And in this case, the populists in some cases have this thin line cruising to extremism in some cases. They have democratic politicians have populist moments as well. But it's a question, for example, in the German campaign, there are a lot of politicians who say we have to prohibit the burqa in the public space. But it's very different. There are different forms to tackle with this issue, and there is sometimes the thin line to racism, to blaming it to migrants, or to say, okay, what is the political culture in our country? What are the forms of being together in a public space? And therefore, not every answer is so equal to each other. It depends who is saying it and who is saying it in what context. And actually we see debates, and in Germany we have a quite interesting experience coming from our history. And today, if you see the campaign, one would say, how is it possible that Angela Merkel is so successful in Germany? If you hear her, it's quite a boring form of doing politics. She always tries to explain, she always tries to show the complexity, and she refrains absolutely to be populist. For example, it's easy to blame Mr. Erdogan for a lot of problems in Germany, or in migration issues. It's easy to say, oh, this is all a mess, and you can be successful with not populist methods. And this needs credibility. You need to show results. You need to show results to the needs of the people, and if you do this, you can be successful in a manner which is not necessarily a populistic one. And I think, for example, you mentioned, Ravi, you mentioned Brexit. In this case, it was a lot about credibility as well. If you tell the people, like Mr. Cameron and others did, what a mess is the European Union, and then you come back with very thin results and tell the people, now things changed and now we are in favor, this is not credible. And in this case, some aspects Vincent mentioned had been there. It's the cities against the land side. It's the elites against blue-collar workers losing ground. It's the young people against sometimes the older ones. In Brexit, it was quite clear who voted leave and who voted remain. And in this case, it's easy actually to blame the elites because they did not do a good job when it comes to the financial crisis in 2007, 2008. Everybody has in mind how the bankers behaved. Actually, if you look to the automotive industry, in many cases you see what the elites in the economy sector did, and many people are not convinced about the results. So it's easy to tell the people, I have simple answers. And when it comes to this in Europe, I'm quite optimistic. In Germany and I think in other places you find it as well. The rise of populists was not so strong as one could believe. When you look to Spain, for example, Spain has a very problematic situation when it comes to Jewish unemployment, for example, but Podemos was not the answer for many people. If you look to Greece, Syriza, populism, extremism from the left with Mr. Tsipras and Mr. Varoufakis, a moment, but actually people are going back to older parties like Nea Demokratia and others. If it comes to Germany, I mentioned that. In France, people in the moment when it became decisive, they voted Macron and they did not vote Marine Le Pen. And in Germany, sometimes there is a phenomenon to see when it is really important, people think more about what they are doing. Sometimes there are elections, people do not think they are so important. On the local level, elections for European Parliament, so you can do what you want. It has no consequences. But when it comes to an important national election, things are different, and therefore Mrs. Merkel will win the elections, not the AfD.
Thank you, Frank, for that frank exposition. You know, I was in UK last June during Brexit, and I was rather taken aback when I saw Nigel Farage and his, you know, that poster, Enough, or something like that, you know, about all those people. It was a picture taken in Slovenia, 1,600 kilometers away from London, but it was projected as something immediate. Boris Johnson and another person. And who is it? You know, lots of examples like this of complete expediency. You know, you spoke about a hardworking politician like Mrs. Merkel, but do you think too many politicians are taking the easy way out, and is that a function of political laziness?
I think there is a lot of space in politics, in political parties, a lot of need for reform, obviously, to attend people's needs, to have people included, especially young people, but as well people not traditionally so close to political parties. I don't know if it's laziness, but maybe they're...
I mean, Britain, after all, was one of the first countries to globalize. The East India Company was founded in 1600, yeah. Right?
Yeah, but today we see that for a long time, and I think globalization is a big issue, especially in the traditionally industrialized countries. For a long time, people saw the benefits. Free trade agreements, for example, in Germany, it's a no-brainer to be against TTIP, against TPP, against CETA. People feel fear that they are not able to compete. In Europe, for example, we see aging societies. Aging societies are not so much interested in winning the future, but defending what they have. And defending what they have, it's easy for populists sometimes to attend it. And the media system was mentioned. I think this is important. If you look to the information age today, if you look how people do inform or not inform themselves, it's quite difficult to come through with complex explanations. It's easier to keep it short and simple.
Right. Thank you. Frank, with your huge experience all over the world in all these years, do you see the national security state reacting against populist leaders? I just saw Mattis standing up to the president on, I think, the gay issue recently. If you look at Erdogan, the military is very suspicious of him. In Thailand, you see the army has come out against Yingluck. Is that a phenomenon that we have to watch for because of excess populism, that people who feel they speak for the state in a selfless way, could react? And is that a threat that we face to democracy?
Maybe. We as a political foundation, we see actually a lot of discussion where people try to bring stability against democracy.
Right.
When we look to Egypt, when we look to other countries, to say, many people say,
exactly.
okay, the world is so shaken, better a dictator
Absolutely.
which keeps it calm.
Yeah.
Not important if Mr. Sisi, for example, in Egypt is breeding now with his form of doing these things, the next generation of terrorists.
Absolutely.
But for the moment, the people have the idea that it's calm. And,
Right.
and I think this is a big risk what you are mentioning. And I think the best form of dealing with this is a very vibrant civil society. In the United States, I'm not so much afraid, because if you look, Mr. Trump has his limits. The limits are in Congress, the limits are in the media, the limits are in the justice sector. So he wants to do something, then there's a judge saying, no, you can't. Yeah. Or there is no majority even inside the Republican Party on many issues. So if this is the case, it's easier. If you have a country where there's a very weak civil society, where there is not checks and balances in place, where there is no divide of powers, in this case, it's a lot more problematic.
Thank you very much. Astik, from the world's largest democracy.
Thank you. A lot of my points have been raised by Vincent and the panelists. So I'm going to reiterate the things that are happening in India, and some of them that are common. And one of the reasons, in fact, I have 4 that are pertinent to India when we discuss the rise of populism. The first is, of course, a radically changed political economy of global labor. And vis-a-vis, we're seeing the rise of immigrants and immigration as a problem in various countries. In Germany, in fact, in the US, in fact, the H-1B1 visa, which Indians used to take, especially the IT sector, that's been reduced. Second, the perceived inadequacy of the state to address these challenges of globalization. Third, the growing insecurity amongst people, the common citizens, that's becoming a part of our daily lives. Whether it's related to issues of national security, terrorism, public health, unemployment, lack of spending on infrastructure. I mean, it's an endless list, in fact. And I think all of this is being aided by the rise of social media. It's bridged the gap in many ways, at least in Asian countries and in East Asia, between the urban and rural. And I think that, in a way, especially in India, helps leaders who do not speak the language. And India is a huge country with, we've got 18 languages as part of the National Gazette. So for a leader like Modi, who doesn't speak, let's say, a language from southern India, to bridge the gap vis-a-vis social media. Let me talk a bit about the rise of Modi and how it started, in a way. What was the scenario in India in before 2014? We had crony capitalism, we had corruption on a mass scale. So, for example, some of the scams that we had in India, we had the Commonwealth Games, and there was a huge Commonwealth Games scam which runs into hundreds of millions of dollars. The allocation of 2G spectrum, that was again a huge scam. The allocation of coal blocks, coal mining blocks. All of these scams weren't unearthed by the ruling BJP party, but by the CAG, which is the official audit accounting agency of the government. Moving on, of course, manufacturing was not happening at a fast pace. Jobs, the economy, as Bill Clinton famously put it in his election many, many years ago, it's the economy, stupid. And that's something that was not going well. And a big chunk of India, the 850 million young people in India, they're aspirational. No one was talking to them. And that's what Modi picked up on. That's the messaging that he picked up to drive. And the first place that he spoke was a college, the best commerce college in India, where he addressed the aspirations of the youth, and he took questions from them, directly connecting with the constituency that was to elect him in 2014. I want to move on to what is Modi and how he rose. And I think one of the questions I have to answer is about the 2002 riots that took place in Gujarat, where he was the chief minister for 13 years. There were Hindu car sevaks, as we call them, or Hindu nationalists in a way, who were traveling in a train. 52 of them were slaughtered and murdered when the train was set on fire. That led to riots in the state, and many blamed Modi for being implicit, for not doing as much through the state administration. However, in 2012, and there was a huge, vicious campaign, some call it in that way, to target Modi for his ineffectiveness and lack of administration. In 2012, the Supreme Court, the SIT, the Special Investigation Team that was set up by the Supreme Court, did not see any wrongdoing by Modi. In fact, in the Supreme Court's words, further in 2014, there was a plea to reinvestigate, and the Supreme Court said, the plea is baseless, and the contest to open the SIT investigation again into these riots should not be taken further. So in a way, for 10 years, he fought the traditional media, and something which Winston pointed to in his presentation, this aids populism in a way, where you have a leader being villainated, who's being projected as the evil, and then he uses a medium which directly connects to a constituent. In this way, he was able to galvanize support that was growing, that was there in rural India, but not amongst the urban elite. Another thing which, when he came to power, and he's a great orator, he started rallies where he would address a group of 500 to 7,000 people in one go. His story is that of a tea seller, and I think that's another reason that helps and aids populism. He's not a dynastic ruler, and in many Asian countries, we see the rise of dynasties. A tea seller who joined the BJP, the ruling party, who grew up its ranks and then became a chief minister, served for 13 years. And there's a Gujarat model of development that has been tried and tested. And of course, there are flaws to it, but there are many successes on which he projected his national campaign. So this story was projected at a national level. And his fight was against three things: corruption, the large-scale corruption and the issues that I just mentioned, the appeasement of minorities. And in India, successive governments have appeased sections of different minorities by giving subsidies or grants or freebies. Modi has been against that. And third was against the elitism. And, you know, in the UK, we call it the Whitehall Club. In the US, we call it the Washington, DC Consensus, you know. In India, we call it Lutyens Delhi or the Lutyens Club, where a coterie of advisors would advise the prime minister on various issues, and then they would not be looking beyond New Delhi for ideas and you know, suggestions. Modi wanted to break that club, and he was seen as an outsider, and that's what Trump is in many ways. That's what in Philippines, you know, Duterte is. He's an outsider to the system. So Modi's rise has been fundamental in a way that from being CEO of a state to being this crusader against the system, the inherent drawbacks of the system. I'm going to leave it here with one of his slogans that he tries to, on which he galvanizes people in India, which is Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, which Trump also famously used to galvanize Indian Americans in his campaign. This basically translates into you know, taking everybody forward in the nation building process. And that's something he's been harping on, development, development, development. How far will he succeed with all these schemes that he's come out with? And all of his schemes, mind you, similar to Trump once again, have the word India in it. So it's America first, and it's Startup India, Make in India, Digital India, and so on. So I'll leave it there. And
Thank you. That's very interesting, Astik. And Astik mentioned a speech that Modi made. If I recall, in that speech, he pressed several buttons that appealed to the youth. And in one spot, if I remember, he spoke about water tables, dwindling water tables across the country. And, you know, politicians don't talk about things like water tables, but he tailored his message to the audience, and I think that's one of the, that's why he's so brilliant as a communicator, if you remember that speech. Now, we have about 15 minutes left, and I don't want to take up time myself. I'd like to open it up to the audience. There must be plenty of questions. I have Audrey Quack here, my colleague. Could you give her the mic, please?
Okay, thanks, Ravi. Okay, I have one question. I've heard several reasons, you know, the anti-elitism, you know, the tiredness with globalization. Could the panelists also address one issue that has also been talked about in the rise of these populists, and that is identity politics, right? Like Modi, for instance, there's the accusation that he plays on this Hindutva thing, you know. It's very subtle, it could be dog whistling, right? He doesn't come out, obviously, to say it. And even the US, you know, Trump and the white voters, you know, obviously, I think Lee Atwater, many, many years ago, said, in the 1950s, you can use overtly the word nigger, nigger, nigger. In 1960s, you can't say that. So you go roundabout. You say things like Cadillac driving welfare queens. So it's not overt, but how much do you think a factor is it in the rise of populism? You know, apart from the obvious cases of economic disparity and all that. Because, Ravi, we do see it in Asia, in Malaysia as well. You demonize one group, you know, the Chinese. They are like the Jews. They control the economy. We should get back, you know, what's ours. Yeah, thanks.
So great question, and it elicits a lot of response from me. First off, I see a bias. I see a bias that center-left parties can play identity politics. LGBT is a great example. Or take little issue wedges, advertise to those people, take issues to those people, and nobody calls them out on anything. If Donald Trump says he wants to limit immigration, and I agree to that, I'm a racist. That's where anyone trying to have a dialogue with me loses me. As soon as you call me racist, sure as hell I don't want to talk to you anymore. And sure as hell I'm going to vote for whoever you think and who you're labeling. Like you said, labels. That's where I get really upset. It's the secondary effect. Are there identity politics? Yes. Every party plays identity politics. Let's be honest about it. Hillary Clinton plays identity politics. She went out and reaches out to African American communities because it's smart politics. The white voter in the United States is disproportionately the largest share of the electorate. So Donald Trump needs white voters to win. He needed folks from that book, Hillbilly Elegy, in the Appalachian region of Ohio and of Pennsylvania. That's how he won. Of course there's identity politics. But it's on both sides. It's not just populist parties. And to me, the secondary effect that gets me really going is when we throw words out at people and call them racist. That gets me going, and that makes me dig in my heels. My goodness, you want me to dig in my heels for Donald Trump? Call me racist.
Thank you. Dr. Kurata, please.
Just a very short response to that. There's a huge analysis done by Ronald Inglehart and Pippa Norris trying to understand whether it's economic insecurity or cultural backlash that's causing the rise of populism in liberal democracies in the West. And they find that it's cultural backlash more than economic insecurity. So when we ask her, so what's the solution here? If it's cultural backlash, if it's the rejection of the cosmopolitan, liberal, the people who are against, let's say, same-sex marriage, globalization, immigration. It's a reaction against the cosmopolitanization of these societies, right? So what's the solution here? Do we just wait for that generation to just move on and celebrate the new cultural patterns that we see among younger generations? But yeah, I think it's an important intervention in this debate because there's a tendency to say it is economic insecurity and then look at identity politics as something secondary. But yeah, there is an argument using large data set that suggests actually it's cultural backlash. So your comment is on point.
Thank you. Ma'am. Yeah.
Thank you. I would like to contribute a thought to you, Vincent, because when you're using the term the media, I contradict that expression because I think it's almost populist to use a term like that because there is nothing like the media. You would probably agree with me that Fox News and CNN are not the same type of the media. And 538, who does an excellent job in differentiating different polling questions, is not equal to, I don't know, the National Enquirer. So having said that, I was wondering if, in your opinion, there are any red lines that even populations shouldn't cross, also from your experience in campaigning. Thank you.
1 second before I ask somebody to respond. Is there one more question? Maybe it might be related. Yes. You're Mr. Agarwal, right?
Yes, Ravi Agarwal. A word which we use better in India or differently is majoritarianism. And it's a word which has also been mobilized in many Supreme Court judgments of India, looking at, and the many ways in that word is used. Populism is a word which is not so used, so much I've encountered in India. I'm wondering if they're the same thing, or there's something different between the idea of majoritarianism and populism.
Thank you. Vincent, would you respond to the first and I'll ask Frank to respond?
Sure. So let me start with the second part of what you said. I think, sadly, in the United States at least, that we are at a place where nothing surprises anyone anymore. And is there a line that Donald Trump or any politician could do anymore and cross? I think we are way past that. I honestly think we are past that. I don't think it's one single instance. You could go back to the decay of, what do you want to say, morality in politics, and not morality in terms of a Christian sense, but just in a common decency sense, across all parties, right? I mean, Bill Clinton, who I actually think was a fairly good president, lied under oath. Everyone knows that. So if you have your president lying under oath, if we have, an entire American public that is used to profanity, that is used to sometimes sexist and misogynistic and belittling and racist and things that are rude and and make objects and subject the LGBT community, then no one's going to be surprised anymore at anything that comes out of the president's mouth. I think that's very sad, personally. I think it's very, very sad, but I don't think that there's any line. To your first part, I'm playing a little bit here, of course, when I say the media, okay? So you just have to understand that. I personally understand that there's a very good purpose of the media, the fourth branch of government, check everybody. I think that's awesome. When I'm referring to the media, I'm of course referring to the traditional media in the United States, New York Times, Washington Post, which the Washington Post right now, their little headline, right? Democracy dies in the darkness. How can I trust a single thing they say? Because that headline on their newspaper now is pretty much an attack on the president. That's pretty much what it is. How can I trust what the Washington Post is saying? When the headline on their website, Washington Post, democracy dies in the darkness. We all know, talk about subtlety. That's more than frickin' subtle, right? We know who every story that they're trying to say now is obviously biased. So I love the media. I would love unbiased media. But is the media truly unbiased? Most of the media is not in the United States. Fox News, by the way, I don't watch Fox News. I don't watch Fox News because I can't stand people shouting and just telling me what I want to hear. So I was kidding when I said that yesterday. I can't stand Fox News. I don't watch Fox News.
Once again, I think it's interesting hearing the term red lines and the differences between populists and extremists. And I think sometimes in the discussions we are exactly there. It's not about the issues, it's about the answers. I can feel migration as a problem, but when my answer is, for example, in case of Mr. Trump blaming the Mexicans in a form in the campaign when it was clearly racist, or when I see the Charlottesville answers of the president saying, oh, there was a Ku Klux Klan, but on the other hand, there were a lot of good people around there. Sometimes I see these discussions as well in Germany in the actual campaign. When I have a campaign with the AfD, there are people tackling an issue, saying, okay, what some people are feeling about migration is a problem, but when I say I need to deport a responsible politician from our country to Anatolia because she had a Turkish name, for example, there is this red line crossed, for example. And in this case, it's not populist any longer, it's extremist. It's not the form, how the people say it, it's the thinking which is behind sometimes this. And for me, always this ethnic aspects of identity, there it becomes very, very critical. In Germany, obviously, for our history, but comparing it with other countries as well, I see we have to be very, very careful how to deal with minority inside our countries, and this is in all European countries an issue, but not only there.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can I just say,
Yeah,
can I say one more thing? So I struggle a lot, and I feel like I'm, again, like a case study of one up here. I struggle, and my wife struggles, as Christians, what to do about Donald Trump and about some of the things that Donald Trump says. And everything you just said, I totally agree with. But I don't think most Trump supporters agree with every single thing that comes out of his mouth. I think that we know that a lot of what he says is rude, misogynistic, sexist. My goodness, you can go on and on and on, okay? But at the end of the day, I don't make my voting decision on his comments that he says about people. I make voting decision on pocketbook voting, what keeps most money in my pocket and what keeps me safe. And that's what a lot of people do. So we're concerned about the buzzwords and commentary and personality, but it's not all about that. At the end of the day, it's not, even with these charismatic populist leaders. So when I went in to vote, there was no question, despite some of the gross and vile things that were said by my president, okay, that I wanted to vote for who was going to keep me safest. That's why I ended up doing what I did. And that's why a lot of other Trump voters do what we did too. But when you label everybody racist, or when you say that because I support Donald Trump, that I'm racist, that's when you lose any kind of civil discussion. So I would just really hope that I think I'm a nice person, okay? I'm not racist at all, okay? But just because I want to lessen immigration doesn't mean I'm racist. Just because I'm concerned about radical Islamic terrorism doesn't mean I'm racist. So that's all I want to say.
Any other question? If not, I'll ask what you might call a provocative question. Do you folks see the rise of populist caliphate around the world, and are they feeding off each other? I saw that Trump, for instance, intervened in the Brexit by talking about, he took a pro-Brexit line and said, yes, the Brit should get out of Europe. Are they feeding off each other? Are they drawing lessons from each other? Is that something that you see, Frank?
I think this is at least a fear one could have. We see it that terrorist attacks, for example, in Europe, they are coming from people with an Islamic background. And the Islamic State is very much interested to divide our societies. We have big Muslim minorities, for example, in Germany. So if you gain the possibility to bring the majority against these minorities, to say, okay, you have this religion, so I see you with suspicion, I'm think that you could be a person with sympathy for the terrorists. In this moment, they really are getting what they want. And this is the problem. It's not the kind of, or it's the kind of reaction of the society. And we should be very clear on that. And when I see some reactions, a Muslim ban for traveling, for example, I think there is some way in this direction that it's a success for the Islamic State, the so-called.
So I would answer that question with, to me as an electoral practitioner, it's about winning. So when Donald Trump actually tweeted out his support essentially of Marine Le Pen in the French election, that didn't help us because people in France didn't like Donald Trump. Even Marine Le Pen supporters didn't like Donald Trump, and that's where we actually try to put all these cases of populism into a box, and they're not all the same. In France, roughly half of Marine Le Pen's supporters wanted to stay in the European Union, right? Even though she was talking about that issue. So it's not analogous everywhere, all of these cases. And just because Donald Trump gets involved in these races, I know the media picks up, Donald Trump tweeted his support for Marine Le Pen. Well, yes, that was an interesting news story, but it certainly didn't help us, and maybe the media knew that, that's why they talked about it. But certainly, it did not help us.
Thank you. Astik?
I think I actually want to comment on Trump. In India, we had Mrs. Indira Gandhi, who was the Prime Minister, who imposed emergency. That was the time when democratic freedoms, especially for the press, a bunch of leaders were jailed. You had to do with your civil liberties, democratic freedoms. You couldn't print what you wanted. So when you talk of the New York Times being able to print that line on top of its website, I think, the Washington Post, democracy is not threatened over there. There is and I think the media also needs to understand, and politicians tend to criticize the media quite a bit for this, that a part of it is also a media construct in many countries. Donald Trump has been what he has been. He's not changed after coming into the White House. In India as well, Modi was, and he was talking about these issues the way he was in Gujarat as chief minister. In Philippines, Duterte was more or less the same. So people have known these leaders and they've elected them. And I think they're being averse to the media projection that they're getting is also pushing them towards social media. So the bottom line is perhaps let's probably take a few steps back sometimes, perhaps as a journalist or as a politician, and try and view the world a little differently.
Yeah, thank you. Nicole, last word. Are we seeing a caliphate of populists?
I doubt it. I think I would like to end on an optimistic note, actually, because, what is one big message that we can get out of the growing public support for populist leaders? One lesson is that these are people who are willing and able to take part in the democratic process. They're just looking for a space to make their voices heard. If we look at Venezuela during the term of Hugo Chavez, of course it's easy to criticize Hugo Chavez for the demagoguery, but one consequence of that is the organization of people into communal councils, right? The consejos comunales. These are councils where people learned how to write their own constitution, master their constitution. So whatever you think of the Chavez regime, there is a group of people who have been marginalized in the society for a long time, who knew their democratic rights and would use the same political education to critique Nicolas Maduro now. So the argument here is even in the Philippines, where a lot of people are disparaged for being Dutertards or Duterte's retards, what we don't see here is a group of people who are willing to use their own money to support a political candidate that they've never done that before, to use their own money to print T-shirts, to print posters. These are people who lost everything, let's say in my case study, in the disaster. So the argument I just wish to put forward here is there's a particular political energy that can be harnessed among publics that support populist leaders. And I think that's something that should allow us to be optimistic, that there is space, that there's a demand for political participation. The challenge now is to use that energy to something more productive and for democratic ends.
Thank you very much. That's a very optimistic...
Can I just add one line? I think, this is a huge debate in India about populism, the rise of the right wing. It's in some ways the rise of, it's the era of the rise of Caesars, whether it's female or male. At some sense, we perhaps, and it's the rise of the right wing. There's not much been written by the right wing. There aren't too many public intellectuals from the right wing, especially in India. So let's perhaps stop demonizing the right wing and the rise of the right wing, leaders. Let's be open to that debate.
Message received. Thank you very much. Clearly, we have a lot of right-wing people. Anyway, thank you very much for this brilliant panel. Please give these people a hand. They come a long way and given us very interesting views.